Sometimes it takes a minute. Oh, there we go. Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest, somebody who I've listened to many times on many different shows. We were just talking in the pre-show. I just heard him on James Corbett. I listened to it in its entirety. His name is Nick Bryant, Bryant, and he's a very accomplished author and journalist. And also, this is like a perfect time to interview him because he was involved in the Epstein situation. I'm calling it that, or saga, that going back before it even kind of blew up in the public, maybe in 2018, 2019. He is the author of a great book on the Franklin scandal. It's called The Franklin Scandal, A Story of Power Brokers, Child Abuse and Betrayal. That was 2009. His most recent book is The Truth About Watergate, A Tale of Extraordinary Lies and Liars, 2024. And then he co-authored a book, Confessions of a DC Madam, The Politics of Sex, Lies, and Blackmail, in 2015, with Henry W. Vinson, talking about sexual political blackmail. So this is going to be a theme. He was involved in finding this black book. I'm going to bring it up back in, I think he found it in 2012 of all times. I think there was a manager was trying to sell it, to pitch it, and he had trouble. He can talk more about that. It didn't hit the public until 2015 is my understanding. And he found some other manifests. And if you're watching this on Rockfin, Rumble, or X Twitter, you will see his website. And it is epsteinjustice.com. So I'll put a link in the show notes. And you can just read the title here. Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell did not act alone, yet no one else was prosecuted. You've felt helpless to fight these sex traffickers until now. So I've titled this episode, Epstein Justice Now, because there still is a requirement for justice. And it's been in the news so much, but I'm really delighted to have him. So Nick Bryant, welcome to the show.
Glad to be with you, William.
So for people other than your background, I mean, you were involved in this Epstein stuff before it became popular, and now it's just risen up in the last week or two. Maybe you can talk firsthand about your background, how you got involved in Epstein, and just leading up to today.
I was in academia up until 1995. And at that point, I decided to move to New York City and become a freelance journalist writer. And that's what I did. And I'd written a lot about children's issues. I've been sensitive to children's issues. So I'd written a lot about that. And then in 2002, I saw this innuendo on the internet about a nationwide trafficking network that was centered in Omaha, Nebraska, that flew kids around the country, that was connected to the CIA, that was plundering Boys Town for underage victims, and also connected to blackmail. And I was a little incredulous, of course, because that's not a story like that isn't very profuse or prolific. But I came from academia and I studied philosophy. And an important thing about, at least for me, studying philosophy is to approach everything agnostically and to acquire as much information about the subject as I can before I decide one way or the other. So I went to Omaha, and it was a cold winter, and I started to dig into what would be called the Franklin scandal. And I met a victim, and I met one of the blackmail photographers. I met a senator that had tried to expose it. I'd met a number of people. And one thing that really jarred me was these people were frightened to talk about this. It was like I was writing an expose on the KGB in Stalinist Russia. And I was followed, and the last night I was there, I actually had a death threat. So I knew I was on the right path as far as the story. And when I came back to New York, I mean, I spent a week in Nebraska, and by that time I realized that this was a huge pedophile network, and it had plundered Boys Town, and it was certainly covered up by the state and federal authorities. And I felt like there was a pretty good chance that it was connected to intelligence. I wasn't able to nail down the DC component of this, the DC blackmail component, but I left pretty shocked. I was stunned that our government would cover up child trafficking or perpetuate child trafficking, have anything to do with child trafficking. And I felt like I had to do something about it. A lot of people, when they see just really abominable evil, can turn away, and because they can't do anything. And I felt like, well, I'm a writer and maybe I can do something. So I spent the next 7 years on that book, and I went about as deep into a child trafficking network as someone can get. I mean, I was able to get to many levels of it and get a lot of corroboration. And the book was published 2009, 2010, and nobody wanted to buy it. And I was on podcasts. These are kind of nascent podcasts with lunatics. And that was very tough. And nobody wanted to buy the book. I mean, the books, and I worked very hard at that book. And there was really, I had a lot of stuff nailed down. But people weren't ready at that point to concede that their government was involved in child trafficking or covering up child trafficking. And I'd gotten a heavy dose of cognitive dissonance when I was pitching it in New York to various magazine editors. And after a while, I could see the wheels start to turn. And they would think, this is a horrible story, and I need to help Nick Bryant. Or I can write Nick Bryant off as crazy, and I can have a nice dinner with my family tonight. And I also had some friends that were big shots in publishing, and nobody was willing to help me. A good friend of mine, I'm from Minneapolis, and a good friend of mine from Minneapolis that I'd known for decades had his own column in the New York Times, and he was completely unwilling to help me. And I started to look at Epstein in 2012. I was pretty devastated that I'd spent 7 years on a book and we really couldn't get many people to buy it. It was all over the internet, but I found out that people liked the internet version of the book rather than the factual version of the story, because it had bounced around on the internet for a long time, and it had been conjoined with reptilians, reptilian shape-shifting ETs, and the Illuminati and things like that. So, and then Wikipedia did a number on it and locked that page down, and no one could touch it. So I was pretty disillusioned. But I saw that Jeffrey Epstein had molested various girls. At that point, he was a lone pedophile. And there was a grand jury that came out and said he hadn't molested a single child. So, and that same thing happened in Nebraska. There was a grand jury that came out and said that not a single child had been molested by the Franklin trafficking network. And there was a state grand jury and federal grand jury. So I went down to Florida, and I felt like I had to look into it. And at that point, I did acquire the Black Book. And the Black Book, in addition to having a lot of perpetrators, it has over 100 victims. And I started to call the victims, and they were telling me about being flown around and flown to an island. And again, at this point in 2012, Jeffrey Epstein was just a lone pedophile. So I took the Black Book back to New York and I pitched it, and no one wanted to touch it. And actually, I almost gave up on it. And then I met John Cook, who was the editor-in-chief of Gawker at that point. And he said they'd be willing to do it. And at that point, we put up the Black Book. And in the interim, I had acquired a number of flight logs too. So we put those up. So I was the guy that put up the Black Book and the flight logs.
Amazing. Yeah. And it's just a who's who of elite important people. Probably, I'm assuming you saw some overlap between Epstein and Franklin, because it may have been centered at Franklin, but those kids' testimonies, Bonacci and Troy Boner was another one. They were being moved around, right?
They were flown around,
Flown
yes.
around, yeah.
And a major common denominator, I mean, there's a number of common denominators, like grand juries that have been corrupted and federal law enforcement that has clamped down on anybody trying to tell the truth. But a major common denominator was William Barr. He was the attorney general under Bush 1, who covered up the Franklin network. Thornburg was the attorney general before Barr, and he initiated the cover up, but then Barr kind of put the finishing touches on the cover up. And Barr was the attorney general for Trump, the Trump 1 administration, who also covered up Epstein. So, and you can see how these guys get recycled, how these dirty players get recycled.
He also lied. I think he's proven lied about Epstein's death in jail, because he made some statement that said like he had seen in there, but people who've been in the jail said that it's contradicted. It's not the truth. That's my understanding.
Yeah, I mean, William Barr has been with the CIA forever. And it's even on his Wikipedia page that is CIA. I mean, you can't really dispute it. And if you look into William Barr, I'm not going to get into his background, but if you look into William Barr's background, he's a very, very dirty guy. He's covered up a lot of major criminal activity by branches of our government.
Wow. Right. So Barr cover-ups, grand jury cover-ups, Epstein cover-ups, right? Even going back to Acosta and these sweetheart deal all the way back in 2008, right? That was the first one.
Well, actually, the first one was in 2007. In 2005, the neutron that went into the plutonium here is a 14-year-old girl told her stepmother that she had been molested by Jeffrey Epstein. And her stepmother brought her to the Palm Beach Police Department. And at that point, the Palm Beach Police just looked upon Epstein as a very wealthy philanthropic type. They did not know about his dark side. And the girl described the interior of his home and also his anatomy. And they believed her. And just the details that she was able to remember. And then she said who recruited her. And the Palm Beach Police Department ultimately found that person. And she just opened up very quickly. And she had gone to the same high school, and she was recruiting girls from high school. She had graduated at this point, and there were like 8 girls that she had recruited. And then the Palm Beach Police Department ultimately found 23 victims that had been recruited, and they were ready to arrest Jeffrey Epstein. Actually, I've got the warrant for his arrest. They were going to arrest him. They had the statements of 5 victims, and then they had the corroborating statements of 17 people. So they were going to arrest him on 4 counts of unlawful sexual activity with a minor and 1 count of lewd and lascivious molestation. And then that case got taken away from them and given to a grand jury. And usually grand juries are just in Florida, it's rare to have a grand jury that looks at anything other than a capital case. And that grand jury was dirty. I don't know if your audience is familiar with how easy it is to corrupt a grand jury, but a special prosecutor is chosen, and he or she presents the evidence that are shown to the grand jurors and calls the witnesses that the grand jurors listen to. And grand jurors are just citizens that have shown up for grand jury duty. So a special prosecutor, there's that quip by a former New York Supreme Court justice who said that special prosecutors have so much power over grand jurors that they could get them to indict a ham sandwich. And the special prosecutor in the Epstein case only called 2 Epstein victims. And one was 14 when she was molested by Epstein, and she was now 16. And one was 16 when she was molested by Jeffrey Epstein multiple times. And she was now 18. And that special prosecutor skewered those girls, skewered them. And at one point, she's calling them prostitutes. I mean, and here's a very fragile 16-year-old kid that had been molested by Epstein when she was 14. And the grand jury came back that Epstein hadn't molested a single child. That's where my radar zoned in on Epstein when I was reading about it. And Michael Ryder, he is the hero in this story. He was the chief of the Palm Beach Police Department, and he would not back down. I mean, he was threatened. He was followed. He ate a lot of intimidation, but he wouldn't back down. And then he called that grand jury, I think, the greatest miscarriage of justice in modern times. Wow. Something to that effect. And he went to the Department of Justice and he said, you guys have got to dig into this story and investigate it because all these girls were molested. So the Department of Justice started digging into it. And actually at that point, well, they had a list initially of 34 underage girls that had been molested by Jeffrey Epstein, but they knew of 40. And all of a sudden there was radio silence from the Department of Justice. And what was going on was Epstein's lawyers, which included Alan Dershowitz and Ken Barr, and Roy Roy Black, and they were
Starr wasn't Starr was
Ken Starr was one of them. Yeah. They were cooking up a very, very, very dirty deal. And what ultimately happened was, and I've got the emails between the assistant U.S. attorney and Jay Lefkowitz, who is one of Epstein's attorneys, and they're negotiating this dirty deal. And they've concluded the dirty deal. And the assistant U.S. attorney says there's one justice that will sign off on this of all the judges and magistrates, or I should say magistrate that will sign off on it. Of all the judges and magistrates, she knew of one that was corrupt or gullible or whatever that would sign it. And he signed it. And then the feds sealed it. And attorneys representing the victims and also the Palm Beach Post appealed the sealing. And the Palm Beach police judge, or the Palm Beach County judge, Kenneth Mara, said that it should be unsealed. And the feds, the Department of Justice, appealed that. And then it went to the 11th Circuit. And the 11th Circuit said it should be unsealed. And what we saw there is mind-boggling. That document gave blanket immunity to all the perpetrators of Epstein. All the perpetrators got blanket immunity. And there's the Victim Crimes Right Act. And according to that law, victims of crimes have to be apprised of the adjudication of their perpetrators, and also they get to confront their perpetrators. But the feds had completely disavowed that law. They did not give any of Epstein's victims. They did not apprise any Epstein victims of the dirty deal, and no Epstein victims were able to confront Epstein. So that was what the Department of Justice did. And Alexander Acosta was the U.S. attorney for the Southern Florida. So he was the one that oversaw it. And he was also Trump's first labor secretary. And when he was getting vetted by the Trump administration, he said that he was asked why he went so light on Epstein. And he said, I was told Epstein was intelligence and it was above my pay grade and to stand down. And I did a lot of research on this, talked to some legal scholars. According to these legal scholars, there's only two people in the government that can tell a U.S. attorney to stand down. One is the attorney general and one is the president. And this was in 2007. So the attorney general was Alberto Gonzalez and the president was George Bush II. the cognitively challenged George Bush. And I can't imagine an attorney general covering up a nationwide pedophile network without his boss giving him the okay. So I believe that Epstein's pedophile network in 2007 was covered up from the zenith of power in the United States.
That's amazing. I mean, and it was happening, and there were intimidations of the girls back then too, right?
Yes. Yes.
Because I think I remember seeing it in the court files that they got the black, SUV treatment.
Yes.
They got all their information off of one of the
social media.
Yeah. Like they really did a number on them, tried to prove that they were morally culpable or something like that.
And that they were druggies. And I mean, that's the same old story. We saw it in the Franklin scandal. We've seen it other places. It's killed the messenger.
Yeah. But it was all like the scale of it was really incredible. Like they systematically intimidated all these kids. I mean, God forbid they would come forward. So they're afraid of coming forward. And then it happens. Something kind of similar happened back in 2017 or 18 with Ghislaine Maxwell too, because there was some interesting things happening with Giuffre and some other people. So that, I mean, all this stuff happened. It could have been stopped, right? Nipped back in the 2007, 2008, but it didn't.
Could have been nipped in 2005 had the Palm Beach police been able to arrest Jeffrey Epstein.
Right. And there was another, wasn't there? There were some kind of mysterious deaths around Franklin, and I think Caradori was the guy's name around Franklin.
Gary Caradori was the Senate subcommittee investigator whose plane blew up.
Yeah, he had flown to Chicago, right? Was flying back.
Yeah, he flown to Chicago, and he'd met with a blackmail photographer, and he had got some photos, and he was flying back to Lincoln, Nebraska with those photos, and then his plane blew up.
With his son too, and I think that evidence
with his son, yes, his 7-year-old son.
The reason I know a lot, because I've had Tim Tate on my show 2 or 3 times, and he was the guy who did Conspiracy of Silence.
Yeah,
so he got those kids on film, or Bonacci and Troy Boner and some of these other girl whose name I can't remember now, but at least you could see their faces so you can remember them. They're not just somebody in writing or something like that. But I think one of the cops from Palm Beach, he died young too, like at 50 or. I mean, I don't know.
One of the detectives, Ricari, died of a heart attack, I believe, at 53.
Yeah, pretty young. So then but did they know at that time, or did you see how vast like Epstein's network was? Because I think we know now, people have researched it. It's New Mexico to Virgin Islands to Miami to New York. And internationally, actually, Paris.
And also London and Paris.
Right. Was there an awareness of that kind of international scope back in 2007, 2008, or 2005?
The Palm Beach police weren't aware of it, but I believe that the FBI and the feds were certainly aware of it.
Oh, right.
And what happened there was just really an abomination, because Jeffrey Epstein was able to go on molesting children and providing children to be molested for another 11 years. And that blood is on the government's hands.
It sure is. And it was kind of industrial scale. You mentioned that the girls were encouraged to find other girls, almost like a multi-level marketing scheme.
That happened in the Franklin scandal too.
I didn't know that.
You get the victims to scavenge, and then they get $200 or $300 per victim that they bring back.
But the Franklin was boys and girls. It seems like Epstein was almost only teen girls. Is that correct?
Yeah, the Franklin was mostly boys, some girls, and Epstein was mostly young girls, but there's accounts of girls being younger than 10 years old that he trafficked. And King liked, of the Franklin network, he liked pubescent boys But if you wanted a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old, he'd provide you with a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old. These guys are psychopaths. They're pandering these children to psychopaths. I mean, they don't have to worry. A conscience isn't going to impede what they do.
Incredible. It's incredible. And it's still, I mean, like everything that happened in 2018, there was the raid on the mansion in New York City, and they found evidence like containers or something in there. They're conveniently forgot like where those tapes went, or I thought they were tapes that had the FBI marker on them. Do you recall that at all?
Well, actually, the day after Jeffrey Epstein was arrested in 2019 at Teterboro Airport, the FBI opened up his safe. Now, his safe didn't have the dimensions that one thinks of when they think of a safe. I mean, his safe was the size of a closet. And according to the New York Times, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of images of child abuse material. And there were many, many discs. And also Business Insider reported that there were hard drives too. And there was a strange document that was released by the Department of Justice and the FBI last week. And there is a couple of things that I agree with. I agree with there were more than 300 gigabytes of child abuse material. And I also agree that there's over 1,000 victims. But then it kind of loses me. Then it says that Epstein didn't pander any children to anybody and that there was no blackmail. And I know that Epstein was pandering children to all kinds of guys. And I know that all kinds of guys were getting blackmailed too. That's why no one has gone down for this other than Epstein and Maxwell.
Right. So, I mean, it's just incredible. And I remember you, Giuffre, rest in peace, Virginia Giuffre or Virginia Roberts. She had her own bio, or she wrote an autobiography.
Yeah.
For people who don't know, it's in the Ghislaine Maxwell documents. I read it. And she said she was in that mansion and they had a separate monitoring room. They literally had like a studio for like filming stuff in that place. It was,
well, actually, that all the bedrooms and bathrooms in his New York home were equipped with hidden cameras, like the Franklin scandal. There was a huge house in Washington, D.C. that was equipped for audiovisual blackmail. And according to a couple of victims, there was a room where men, as in plural, monitored those cameras. So right there, you've got a conspiracy.
Right. Like, where are those employees? And what else is happening? Like, what's happening on the island? Right?
And then when the Department of Justice made that dirty deal in 2007, it named co-conspirators of Epstein, but now there's no co-conspirators. Yeah. I mean, Epstein just flew to that island by himself and had martinis and then flew home. I mean, the whole thing is so ridiculous. And we see how Pam Bondi and the Trump administration have just dug a hole deeper and deeper. On February 26th, Bondi said that the Epstein files, now the Epstein files and the Epstein lists have been used synonymously, were on her desk and that she was going to release them. And then she released them and it was like a nothing sandwich. When I released the Black Book with Gawker, we put up, we blacked out, redacted the phone numbers of the adults that were in the book. And then we redacted the last names and phone numbers of the victims. And I saw that book the Black Book that I put up, and the feds had redacted everything.
Right. It was a non-release, right? It wasn't like they released stuff that you had already released. So
I put out more incriminating information on Epstein in 2015 than they did in 2025. But Bondi just keeps getting herself in trouble. So there's no new revelations. And then Bondi declares that she's been bamboozled by the FBI's field office. So either she lied about what she was releasing or she was inept. And I'm a charitable person, so I'm going to go with inept. And then she further tarnished her credibility. Well, she said that there was, quote, a truckload of evidence, unquote. And She said that only matters related to national security would be redacted from the document. So now she has to tell us what a bunch of child molesters have to do with national security. And here's the crescendo of her mendacity. This is a quote from her. There are tens of thousands of Epstein, tens of thousands of videos of Epstein with children or child porn, and there are hundreds of victims. So she acted like the FBI was just looking at that material for the first time when it had opened up Epstein's safe in 2019. And there's no way that the FBI and the dark malignant corner of intelligence that deployed people like Epstein weren't looking at that stuff that night. I mean, they probably were looking at it that day, and guys were doing double shifts to make sure to see what was on that footage. So for her to say that it was the Department of Justice FBI was just looking at it in 2025 was absolute bullshit.
Yeah. Totally.
And then for Trump to come out and say it was the Democrats, I mean, now he's digging himself a deeper hole because it was Butcher Gonzalez and George Bush too that covered it all up and talked about co-conspirators. So the cover-up started under Republicans,
right?
Not Democrats.
And that was under his administration, is when he was arrested in Teterboro, right? So
it was under Trump's administration. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, it's a terrible. It's going to be a slow rolling catastrophe for him because there's so much evidence, the evidence that you've procured. This black book and all stuff. Yeah.
How can he say? So I said that there was a couple of things I agreed with on that strange memo that came from the FBI and Department of Justice, which nobody signed. No one was going to take the fall for that memo, which kind of is humorous in a dark kind of way. But it said that there were over 300 gigabytes. I agree with that. It said that there were over 1,000 victims. I agree with that. But then it says that these victims weren't pandered to anybody. Now we know better than that. And the best thing that you can say to a victim of child sexual abuse or sexual assault is, I believe you. The worst thing you can say is, I don't believe you. So that document that was released last week is saying, I don't believe you to scores and scores of young girls. Right. And that's really malignant. That memo is saying that these girls don't even exist. And that's unbelievably malignant.
Yeah, it really is. You mentioned the VCRA and that they were allowed, these victims came out and made their statements in court after Ghislaine Maxwell. So I actually posted that out on my podcast. I took 2 hours to read it because this was their chance. Then there were 24 girls who took the chance, 24 probably, maybe more, many more, but they actually wanted to tell their stories. So it's on the record, the victims' stories.
Well, Maxwell's trial was a sham because there were only 4 witnesses that testified, and those 4 witnesses had only been molested by Epstein and Maxwell. They hadn't been molested by any other perpetrators. And what I found to be very interesting is Damian Williams, who was the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District. He oversaw the Maxwell trial, and which was very carefully choreographed because there could have been a lot of stuff that came out at that Maxwell trial. And then he was also the guy that oversaw the grand jury on Diddy. And at that point, Diddy had 5 civil suits pending against him, and 2 of them had been minors. He had trafficked 2 girls as minors. And the 5th lawsuit was from Little Rod, or Rodney Jones. He was a hip hop producer. And in his lawsuit documentation, he talks about Diddy trafficking children quite a bit. And then he also talks about hidden cameras. So at that point, Damian Williams decided, and the Department of Justice and whoever else decided, well, we got to rein the Diddy thing in. And
they sure did.
And what they did with that Diddy trial, I mean, I've never seen prosecutors worked so hard to throw a case
Right.
in my life. I mean,
He only had 2 convictions out of just massive criminal drugs and trafficking and
of the Mann
fraud.
Act, of the
Fraud,
Mann
yeah,
Act.
yeah.
I mean, you and I don't have any legal training, but I think that you and I could have actually waged a much more vigorous defense than the assistant U.S. attorneys. And one was Maureen Comey, and she had also, her father was head of the FBI, and
Right.
she had been instrumental in covering up the Epstein trial, and she'd also been very instrumental in covering up Diddy's crimes also.
It's just incredible. So Franklin to Epstein to Diddy, these huge trafficking, blackmail. It goes on, and then you wrote a book also about what's going, like the madams in DC, like
Confessions of a DC Man, Politics of Sex, Lies, and Blackmail, which is just more of the same.
right. So who isn't blackmailed? That's the question. It's not who is, it's who. They probably just target everybody. Don't you think they just target anybody with a pulse?
I think if you can be blackmailed, you are. I think that there are people that aren't blackmailed. We started a organization called Epstein Justice, and what we want is very simple. We want the government to tell us why it covered up child trafficking, and we want the perpetrators to be prosecuted. Pretty simple, kind of a baseline morality. It's going to require a majority in the Senate and the House, and we are starting a campaign of, we've started a campaign of pressuring these lawmakers. And our next webinar is on, where we provide the tools to pressure the lawmakers, is next Tuesday night, July 22nd. So I strongly suggest that your audience go to EpsteinJustice.com and register for our next webinar, because it's going to take all of us. There's over 320 million Americans, and if we can mobilize 1/3 of 1%, that's 1 million people, and we can get things done with 1 million people. I believe that we should be able to mobilize more, but all we got to do is mobilize 1/3 of 1%, and
Right.
we'll get it done.
I mean, there's so much work that can be done. There's so many victims maybe who haven't come forth, and a lot of this stuff. Like, go check it out.
There's well over 1,000 victims, but only that victims compensation program only that was going to give victims settlements from Epstein's estate. 225 women applied and 150 were granted settlements and 12 declined, because if you got a settlement from that program, you signed an NDA.
Wow.
And you couldn't go after any of your other perpetrators.
Wow.
And I've been in this field for quite some time, and I've spoken at a lot of conferences, big conferences. The National Center on Sexual Exploitation holds a world summit every year, and I've spoken at 3 of those. The Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation has an international meeting every year. I've spoken at one of those, and I've also spoken at one of the webinars. I've spoken at a number of conferences, and I've gotten to meet psychiatrists and psychologists that work with sexual abuse victims, child sexual abuse victims. And one of them called me, this was a couple of years ago, and she had a client who she felt had been trafficked by Epstein when she was under 10 years old. And the woman could describe the interior of Epstein's home and some other things that would have been impossible for her to know. And then I know a second therapist who worked with a victim who said that she'd been trafficked by Epstein when she was under 10 years old. Now, both those therapists tried to get settlements for their victims, because when you're trafficked at that young of an age, your life gets decimated, and they were denied. And there's no criteria of who gets what from those settlements, but both those therapists thought that their clients were denied because of they didn't fit the cover story of 14 years. That seems to be what the media has settled on, is that the youngest Epstein victims were 14 years old.
Yeah, no, you don't hear about any of those younger kids. Or I
No.
don't, at least. I mean, it's weird too. Like the Giuffre biography, she said that she had to sit down with Ghislaine and Jeffrey, and they said they wanted her to have a baby, and they would
Yes.
just take the infant. Like God only knows what would have happened to that infant. But like this is dark stuff. They were involved in very evil, very dark stuff. And some of the kids were trafficked from South America that we don't even never know, or like
Well,
if they're
a lot of the kids were trafficked from Eastern Europe. And Jean-Luc Brunel and Epstein started a modeling agency called MC Squared. And Brunel he's a bad actor. I mean, he'd been actually 60 Minutes did a piece on him because he was fond of drugging and molesting underage girls. But he was actually buying, not renting, buying girls in Eastern Europe to bring back here. And according to Virginia Giuffre, they had something worked out with the government where they were able to get visas or passports or something for these underage girls that they were bringing into the United States.
Wow. Probably some corrupt deal. I mean, it's really incredible. I mean, it really was a network. I just ran a video of Giuffre talking about how everybody knew, from the doorman to the chauffeur to the haircutters to the doctors to the lawyers. So there's a lot more information that needs to come out. It's not going away. What number of our politicians are blackmailed? You know, which ones aren't going to make independent decisions or decisions based upon the best interests of their constituents? So, like, this is all vitally important. I mean,
I think we have an opportunity right now, and we might not ever have this again, to clean out our government.
yeah, I think you're right.
I think we have that opportunity. But not only do we need to clean out our government, but there's another major reason why this has to be resolved with justice. According to the Centers for Disease Control, 25% of underage girls and 5% of underage boys in the United States have been molested. Now, a lot of people in the field will say that that's probably slightly conservative for underage girls and way conservative for underage boys. But if you just go with the CDC numbers, there's over 50 million Americans who have been molested as minors. Over 50 million Americans. And the Department of Health and Human Services commissioned a study, I think, a couple of years ago, and it found that between 240,000 and 325,000 women and children were sexually trafficked in the United States every year. Now, here's where it gets really, really egregious. The 2023 Federal Human Trafficking Report found that only 664 individuals in the country were charged with child trafficking. So if we go with the smallest number from the Department of Health and Human Services, 240,000, and only 664 individuals were charged with child sex trafficking. And then there's millions of hours of child abuse material on the internet. And according to the U.S. Sentencing Commission, only 1,375 people in the U.S. were convicted of making and disseminating child abuse material. So there are millions of victims of abuse and trafficking in the United States, millions. And this is another reason why Epstein justice is very important, is because if we allow the Department of Justice to be unresponsive to victims in the Epstein case, a proven trafficking case, that sends a message to millions of victims that they have no voice and no hope for justice. And we have to send the message that you do have hope and you can have a voice. And as long as the government continues to lie about this, we're just negating these children, negating them.
And disincentivizing them from coming forward too, because if they think there's no justice, like they're just going to get in trouble. They're going to be wasting their time or exposing themselves to reprisals or something. So it's this Epstein has to be resolved. He has to get justice. We have to get justice for Epstein.
Well, the thing is with these networks, they're getting kids generally young. A lot of them have been molested previously. Like Virginia Giuffre had been molested when she was 7, and then she'd been pandered by a pedophile named Ron Eppinger. But these networks, they get these kids that are already very damaged, and then they get they endure repeated molestations. And then with the Franklin network, if you perform well, you'd get drugs or alcohol or whatever you wanted. And we see that there's a number of Epstein victims that anesthetize themselves from that particular brutality. And they go on to compromise their own credibility by a lot of times by committing various crimes, and which is almost a perfect system. Is you get these victims and then really damage them, and then they go on to commit crimes and compromise their own credibility.
Right. So it's like it sustains itself through the abuse or whatever, the cycle of abuse or something comes back. Nick, we are at the 45-minute mark. Is there anything else you'd like to add? And where can people find? We have Epstein Justice right here. I'll put a link to that. Where can people find you and your books?
My Epstein Justice is by far more important to me than selling books. So I would say go to Epstein Justice first. If you want to take my books, or if you want to take a look at my books and read my blogs and the other things, you go to nickbryantnyc.com.
nickbryantnyc.com. So there's another, I'll put links to that. So there's 2 websites, but your primary importance right now is for people to check out Epstein Justice. So I
would much rather have people sign up for Epstein Justice than buy my books, to tell you the truth.
Awesome. So there is a sign up kind of thing right here. So you can put your name and your email.
And then you can register for these webinars that we hold. And then as soon as you register, you'll get an email back, and that'll give you the steps that you can take.
Right. And the next one is going to be July 22nd, 2025 at 8 p.m. Eastern. So people check that out too.
On Tuesday night at 8 o'clock.
Yeah, not far away. Just 4 days away from today, people. Check it out. Check out the website. And again, the author is Nick Bryant, and goes back with Epstein all the way to the Black Book. Really incredible. Like your piece of right there. It's some very historically important events. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, William.
All right, stay there. Okay.